This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
To our communities, to our immediate families, because we all know that we live in a very small world community. What goes on in the Middle East in particular has effects in a great way on our lives. But the direction that the American public takes in understanding this conflict is tremendously influenced by where they're getting their information from, how that information is filtered, who's giving it and how they're getting it. As a result, I thought it was very important in order to try to get to the bottom of how is that information transmitted from the Middle East to your living room and your kitchen, to speak to somebody from the editorial board of Newsday who's on the inside, working from within, knows exactly how the bits and pieces of this whole network are working. It's my pleasure to have with us today Larry Levy, who's on the editorial board. He's also a columnist for Newsday. He's been very active in the Newsday community, and it's a pleasure to have him with us. Mr. Levy, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, let's get right down to some of the media, because we have a short period of time. We have a lot to discuss, because this, of course, is an issue that we could talk for hours, perhaps. First of all, if you just tell us a little bit about your role on the editorial board and what the editorial board does, and what is the difference between the editorial board and the news department, and what control does one have over the other?
Right. Well, one side has no control over the other side. And most people don't even understand when I talk about sides. They're probably thinking, well, what am I talking about sides? It's one newspaper. Most major newspapers have a newsroom management chain of command that deals with news. It's supposed to be facts. It is the information that is gathered, packaged, and put generally in the front of the newspaper. The editorial page, the editorial board, deals with the opinion side of the paper. It's the editorial page and the op-ed. And there is a pretty thick wall between the two. In fact, the man who has the title, the editor of Newsday, the editor of Newsday, Anthony Marrow, has nothing whatsoever to do with the editorial page of Newsday. Yes. It's the publisher of the paper who has control of the editorial page. So that whereas the publisher has nothing to do with the newsroom. Really? He's the chief businessman of the paper. The editorial page is the institutional voice. So
he can basically ask individuals who represent his viewpoint to be in charge of the editorial staff.
Yes, he could.
That's why you'll find different types of editorial leanings for different types of newspapers or television networks, depending on who the owner is.
That's correct. And on smaller family-owned newspapers, very often the editorial page is nothing more than a speech-writing platform for the publisher.
Right.
At Newsday and in many other major papers, it's different than that. And I know how I was picked. I was on the investigative team. I was a hardcore, hard-charging, news-gathering journalist. And a new editorial page editor was being named. His name was Jim Klurfeld, who was the Washington bureau chief in charge of news gathering in Washington. And he wanted to try a new job. And Newsday was looking for a new editorial page editor. And he wanted the page to be less predictable, more based on fact, less on what positions we'd taken for years. And he asked me if I wanted to be a part of that, and I was aghast. I said, why would I want to give up being a reporter, which I felt was the highest calling known to man, other than Lubavitch Rabbi, of course. And I said, why would I want to be a speechwriter for the publisher? He says, well, it's not going to be like that. The publisher has hired me, he said, to remake the editorial board, and I want to get people who are first and foremost good reporters, who can get the information, present it to the board, other members of the board, and we can come to an opinion based on fact.
So an editor, in other words, has to do a lot of investigative reporting
also. An editorial writer.
Right.
You should. If you're a good editorial writer, you don't just rely on what you read in the paper and then form your opinion on that. You should go out and verify it. I spend a lot of time at meetings that reporters spend at, and I come to
a different conclusion, perhaps.
Different conclusions than in really reading between the lines of the news story. I can sort of tell the reporter probably came to, though they hide it real well at Newsday. There's a filtering process to try to weed out obvious and blatant opinion from the news sections. And
which is understandable.
The true test was, when I tell friends the story about how I came to the editorial board, I said, well, what did you tell him when he asked you about your position on abortion and on capital punishment and on minimum wage and on the Mideast? They said, I was never asked anything about my opinion on anything.
Really?
He knew me as a person who could be trusted to gather the facts, who could be spirited in promoting a story idea, and he thought that I would have the intellectual honesty to take a position maybe 90 degrees or even 180 degrees from where I started if the facts warranted it.
Okay, let me ask you a question, Larry. Is there a competition between the news department and the editorial board? Is there an attempt to influence, when you see something in the news department, you're going to say, hey, listen, this is directly in opposition to an editorial I wrote last week.
Right.
Well, what goes on in the inside of the stories?
It's interesting you mention that. There's not supposed to be a competition between...
Right, in the ideal world.
The reality is, we all came from, most of us on the editorial board came from the newsroom. We all think of ourselves in some regards as reporters. And some of us, you know, maybe this is a sin, but we have egos. And there's nothing we like more than finding out something before the news reporters do. And it got to be a problem at one point with me, having come from the newsroom and a couple of others, that we were writing editorials about stuff that hadn't even appeared in the news section yet. And it was a problem. And we all agreed that we had to put our egos aside, and if we came up with something fact-wise...
You had to hand it over to the news department.
Well, and we created a very elaborate structure for that.
Interesting. Because
we would go to our boss, who would then go to the publisher, who would then go to the editor, and arrange a meeting, you know, like a shidduch, and you know, to get that information, because they didn't want us communicating directly with reporters.
Right.
So it's they really go to great tortured extremes to do this. So I can tell you the process about which. Well,
I'll tell you what. Let's get to the Middle East, because
sure,
we have a lot of material to cover.
Absolutely.
An issue happens in the Middle East. An event occurs.
An event.
News covers it. How does the editorial board decide this is worth an editorial, not worth an editorial?
Okay. There are several people on the editorial board of Newsday who would normally start the discussion on an issue in the Mideast. One of them is Jim Klurfeld, the editor of Newsday's editorial page. He's traveled to the Mideast many times. He has been, as I said, the Washington bureau chief and covered it diplomatically from the Pentagon and from the State Department standpoint. He covered the Camp David
reports.
He's well
respected. He's on top of the situation.
Very well respected. He's a member of the foreign policy groups, and he's respected by all sides, in fact. Jim will often start the discussion. Adrian Paracchio.
Now, how much of an influence does Jim have over the rest of you?
Well, because he's the boss. Because he reports to the publisher, he has more influence than most people.
He has veto power over any editorial?
Yeah, I would say that's true. He almost never exercises it, and I can give you examples of how it plays out.
Okay.
Yeah, and the publisher has absolute veto power, and to my knowledge, in all the years, I can't think of 1 or 2 times when that's happened.
Interesting.
Yeah, and if 10 members of all 10 or 11 members of the editorial board felt very strongly about something, and Jim did not, he would probably go with the majority. Maybe not in all cases, or he might say, look, let's leave this subject alone for a couple of weeks. I'd like you guys to think about this again. But generally speaking, it is a benevolent, enlightened dictatorship.
Okay.
Right?
That's a very interesting
point. A little like the Roberts movement.
Right? I'll have to quote you on that.
Yeah. So
let's get back to the Middle East.
So Adrian Paracchio is a foreign policy specialist. So he might start the discussion. And I might start the discussion, partly because I have an interest in Israel. I have had for years. As a Jew, it's kind of a no-brainer. I also was in Israel for a month or so, both before and after the prime minister's election, and I wrote 10 columns on it. So, and since then, I've kept up. I get briefings, email briefings from the Israeli Defense Force every day, from the government press office, AIPAC's people over there.
So you're connected over there.
And I get them from some of the Palestinian groups as well. And I spent time in the West Bank, and I spent time, of course, in Jerusalem and within the Green Line.
Great. So once this editorial decision is made, okay, so somebody is chosen to write the actual editorial to represent the opinion of the editorial
Generally
board.
speaking, the person who has the strongest opinion that is accepted as the consensus will be designated to write the editorial.
Okay, fine. Now,
so in the Middle East, Jim Klurfeld probably writes half of our editorials on the Mideast, and Adrian Paracchio writes the other half.
Interesting.
Once in a blue moon, I will be asked to write one, but I'm not a foreign policy expert, and I'm generally off doing other things that if I wasn't doing, then somebody else would have to do.
Okay, now let's talk about some of the controversy,
sure,
which is surrounding not necessarily Newsday, but many, many other papers, whether it be the New York Times, whether it be others across the country, whether it be, of course, CNN.
More television.
Television, and also even the radio, also, NPR. and BBC. So you have a couple of very large, very active groups, honestreporting.com, you have camera.org,
right.
You have other organizations which have been grassroots activist organizations formed specifically for the purpose of keeping track
right.
of, I don't know if you would call it news or editorial, perhaps both, or maybe
both.
one or the other.
Both.
In certain periodicals, because the tendency seems to be very much swerved in one direction as opposed to another.
Sure.
Now,
Newsday gets criticized by some or all of these groups from time to time. Our editorial page tends to get high marks from the so-called pro-Israel groups because we tend to be somewhat hardline. We have called for the we've said that Arafat should go. We've supported Operation Defensive Shield, though we hope, just like most of the Israeli press did, hope that there would be restraint and Israel would not forget what makes it special, which is
right.
the morality of it.
It's the only democracy in the Middle East.
That's right. And so the editorial page rarely gets criticized. Some of the reporters and some of the reporting has been criticized, but some of the very reporters who have been criticized on one report were the ones, for example, who broke the story that there was in fact no massacre in Jenin. So I guess while from time to time I see stories, even in Newsday, I see it on CNN from time to time, I see it in the New York Times even from time to time, that make me kind of cringe, that make me say, I don't know what this person was thinking or what the filtering system was going on that let stuff get in that seemed inflammatory, what some people would call anti-Israel, which often is more anti the government of Israel as opposed to the people of Israel, but that's a whole other discussion. I think that by and large, a lot of these groups are, with all due respect, somewhat paranoid. I have examined some of the criticisms, and we talked before the show about a particular experience I had with a synagogue
right.
that was accusing Newsday of having done something that turned out to be really very, very
right,
different.
But let's say situations have come up where the wording that's used, you're talking about such a delicate situation with so many sensitivities, and very often people in Long Island who have relatives in Israel who are going through literally from day to day barraged by the situation there. And when there's equivocation between the victim and the perpetrator, or there's
or moral equivalence,
right?
Yeah,
and there's different types of words that are used, or when you just show sympathy, more sympathy perhaps for the family of the suicide bomber, the homicide bomber, than perhaps for the victim.
I don't believe that takes place on any routine basis. I think that somebody who feels so passionately about Israel will take any story that shows any kind of sympathy for the so-called other side as being biased, and that any story that would show sympathy for their side as being not enough.
Okay,
where
I hear
you
what you're
stand is
saying.
where you sit. Now
how would you like to balance it?
You could show me 20 examples, and I would probably agree with you with all 20. But I would say there is a much broader context of hundreds of stories. So
you judge it on what basis, then?
I try
the
to
number of stories?
Well, if I read a story in a newspaper where a correspondent has gotten onto the West Bank, and it is about the funeral of 3 children who were blown up by a prior unexploded Israeli tank shell. And people are calling out death to the Israelis, and they're quoted in there. And they call out, they're crying and they're grieving. I take that to be a view from another part of the world. It's a good reminder that they're human beings too. The test of fairness is what's in the paper the next day. What was in the paper the week before? Well, that same reporter, when he or she goes to the grave of, in one of the settlements, for example, where somebody was murdered, show the same sensitivity, the same context or lack of context, without a need to quote a Palestinian official, on it being just or anything like that. I want to see the bigger picture over time. That, to me, is a test.
Okay, now, using that as your test, what newspapers, radio stations, television stations would you say qualify in your mind to be definitely biased against Israel?
None.
None?
None. With an agenda of bias against Israel? None. Not an agenda of bias. I don't believe any...
Let's say CNN, for instance, which is
notorious.
notorious.
I don't think... It's notorious among some Jewish groups, and I think that there are reports from time to time that I read, I'm saying, I wonder what that person is thinking about. But I learn most of what I learn most about I learn more about the atrocities perpetrated against Jews on CNN than I learn about it from anywhere else. All the footage that breaks my heart of the bodies of children hanging out of buses, I get that on CNN. I also happen to get the bodies of Palestinian children too, which as a Jew I want to be reminded. Because I'll tell you something, if we start to even remotely think like they do, if we in any way condone, for example, a settler going and taking revenge, as happened recently after a particularly horrible bombing, then they won. And people who say Jews are being held to a higher standard, I say good, because I want to be held to a higher standard. Because my one overarching concern out of the Mideast, from going there, talking to people, being on both sides, seeing what there was to see, was that while we have to be concerned about the security of Israel, we must do everything we can, including killing, for the security of Israel. We cannot lose sight of the soul of Israel, and that is what is at risk now.
Okay, but you said something interesting. You said that you don't mind if we're being held to a higher authority.
Higher standard.
A higher standard. But that's something for you and I, and perhaps us internally as a Jewish people to
Nothing
say.
wrong with the
but
world
it's not something for the CNN or for anybody or BBC
well, but I don't
to automatically
I don't know that they are. You've got to understand something. You know, we forget something. You look at the coverage of the Six-Day War. You look at the coverage of the 72 War. It was David versus Goliath. It was poor little Israel, and I thought this was just fair coverage, being besieged by the Arab world,
nations, right.
Fighting doggedly, courageously, all true,
right,
on behalf of its homeland. Accurate. Now, what does the world see? The world sees, remember the joke about Saddam Hussein had the fourth most powerful army in the world, which turned out to be nothing. Israel is probably the fourth most powerful army in the world. In some respects, it is probably the best army in the world, with the most modern equipment. And who is it fighting? It's fighting people with sticks, stones, and crude bombs. If you are coming down from if you're coming down from Mars,
talking about a nation that is as small as New Jersey against a place that is population-wise and size-wise.
You're missing my point. You're missing my point.
Okay, go on.
If you come down from Mars and you see an array of weaponry such that Israel has, including the atomic bomb.
But they have no choice.
Well,
they have to have that kind of preparation.
I agree. I agree. But the question is, how do you use it, and for what reason do you use it?
Right.
And that gets us into whole other policy questions
Obviously,
in the Mideast.
Sure, which we don't have time to discuss.
Oh, that's a shame. But I think that what I tell Jewish groups, and I speak every week before a different Jewish group, I tell them you must hold whatever publications you read and see accountable. If you see something you think is wrong, you must write them, you must call them, you must tell them what you think is wrong. But I would only say that, step back a little bit. I don't know how much time we have, but the criticism, the last time Newsday was severely criticized was its alleged lack of coverage of the March on Washington. When it was accused of putting a story on page 47. And when I first heard about that, and the first time I heard about that, because I was away, I spent some time, I didn't see the coverage in the paper those days. I knew it was a big story. I had no reason to believe that these people didn't know what they were talking about. And I tried to explain it and how it might have been. But I was very concerned. I wrote a letter to one of the news editors when I got back, a memo. I heard this at a temple. This is crazy. How could you put this on page 47? It was a big story. Biggest crowd since, ABC. Well, it turned out that and shame on Newsday for burying it on page 47. It turned out that the cover of Newsday was the breaking of the story by Newsday reporters that the so-called Jenin massacre was no massacre at all. This was an incredibly important story.
Right.
The March on Washington was not as important a story as obliterating the myth of the Jenin massacre. But it was packaged on what we call the jump side. It started on page 3, and then it says continued on, page 47. Packaged with the most read story in the newspaper was the March on Washington. The next day we had a story about families there. A week later we had a long story, a magazine piece about one family's odyssey and how it changed their life. I wrote a letter to the rabbi explaining this, and basically he said, you're right about that. So that was one experience I had.
All right. I want to change subjects a little bit because we don't have too much time, but I want to get a little bit into the role of the press, not only in terms of reporting, but in Europe, for instance, of playing an active role in bringing about a tremendous lack of perhaps presentation of the facts. So what is going on? And how does the press see its responsibility as far as being a presenter of the facts and not necessarily editorializing in the news department?
I am not an expert on the European press. But what I do know of the European press is that in many respects and in many countries it's very different than our press.
There's not as much of a split between the news
department. There is no wall
department.
between news and editorial at many of them.
That's like those separation of church and state.
But look at Europe. I mean, Europe comes out of a very different tradition than we do.
Right.
Also, many of the newspapers in many of the countries are tied to political movements and political parties. They reflect a certain
an agenda.
Ideological and an agenda. And unfortunately, you know, Europe has a tradition of anti-Semitism.
It has the history.
I'm not going to excuse it or explain it. Some of the stuff I've seen there frightens me.
Really?
I mean, for the first time in my life, and obviously you could tell I'm one of those guys who, if I get into a debate about whether this guy's an anti-Semite or that guy, I'll argue, you know, back off a little bit. Let's give a guy some chance to prove himself. Let's not react right away. But for the first time in my life, I have found myself being frightened as a Jew. And it's only until fairly recently that I felt
what gave you that
way.
feeling?
What had been going on in France, the burning of some synagogues and some Jewish social clubs and sports clubs, some of the unbelievably inflammatory articles appearing in what we all consider to be mainstream European press. Mm-hmm. Gosh, there was a cartoon in a liberal Italian newspaper, a respected Italian newspaper, that I wish I had in front of me because I may botch it literally, but it was a cartoon of the baby Jesus in the manger looking at Israeli soldiers with the Jewish star saying, "What, again?" In other words, come to crucify, kill me again.
Right.
Oh, man. I mean, you know, that's frightening.
That hurts.
And you realize that how far removed are we from, I mean, it sounds like a different guy from 10 minutes ago, I realize that, but how far are we removed really from the Holocaust?
No, but it's amazing. I agree with you. It's amazing to think that Europe, which experienced what it experienced 50, 60 years ago, can step into a role which it seems so obvious for us looking from the outside, could very easily, God forbid, lead to massive anti-Semitism. And who knows what comes after that.
Okay, but
I'm not trying to blow it out of proportion.
On the other hand,
but I think
some of the policies of the government of Israel over the years, I would argue, have been unnecessarily provocative, have been antithetical to a democratic and a free society. I think some of the settlement buildings have been a terrible, terrible mistake. Up until the start of the Intifada, 2/3 of the people in Israel would have agreed with you, and they'd have given him away like this if Arafat hadn't been as stupid as he was, or as deceitful and cunning and arguably murderous as he was in abetting the Intifada. But in the end, no matter what happens, in the end, this will end at a negotiating table. It will be a negotiating table set up by maybe people we're not quite sure of. I mean, the U.S. will be one of the people doing it. The Saudis will probably be a part of it. Egypt will be a part of it. Maybe even the Syrians under the right circumstance, and the Israelis and the Palestinians. And in the end, there's going to be a negotiation. In the end, Israel is not going to have settlements in Gaza. In the end, Israel is not going to have settlements outside the contiguous settlements of the Green Line.
Okay,
I mean, there's the Green Line.
We'll leave the settlements for a different discussion.
Well, but that's very important. But you're talking about the world view. If the world sees a country...
But the world is not anti-Semitic, or I shouldn't say that. The European press is not coming out against Israel just because of the settlements.
Oh, but that makes it easy for them.
Right. It's something to hang it on.
It makes it easy for them.
Exactly.
Why make it easy for them? That would be my argument.
And if you take away the settlements, they wouldn't find something else?
Some might, but the majority, the mainstream, would have no problem with Israel having a secure and thriving state that they can all make money off of trading with, frankly, within the Green Line. Yeah. I think that most of the world will accept that.
Do you think the settlements are really that much of a
I think
thorn?
the settlements are both a very good excuse and in some respects a legitimate irritant. I mean,
honestly speaking, I would like to believe what you're saying,
right.
But my feeling is that there is a And again, not coming from, I'm not one of these paranoid people who run around, but there is obviously an undercurrent of that anti-Semitism which has so easily come to the surface, which is scary how quickly the transitions take place.
Right. Well,
and that's really what concerns me.
There are a lot of people who are very concerned that, especially given the hate that the Palestinian children are filled with.
We're talking about a culture which is so inundated from such a young age with this type of perspective, and there's a tremendous sympathy, and people looking at the Palestinians as being the David, and of course in Israel being the Goliath.
I understand. I have a little odd theory about that. Remember the novel Animal Farm?
Yes.
Where the pigs take over, and their rallying cry against the farmers are 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. When the pigs finally take control and decide they want to assert their domination over the rest of the animals, they stand up on their hind legs and they say, 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. I have a feeling that children who have grown up under a totalitarian system, who are programmed to do what they're told, if for some reason the Arab world, and already the Saudis have come to the conclusion that this Intifada, this continuing terror bombing, homicide bombing, is not in their interests anymore. If the Arab world and the Palestinian, the leaders, the ones who signed, the 100 of them that signed the ads saying that we've got to end the terror bombing now, if they truly begin to preach, indoctrinate, inculcate on this generation, I think it'll be an issue of 2 legs good, 4 legs bad, switching to 4 legs good, 2 legs bad.
Listen, I hope you're right, but I'm
not sure I'm
afraid
right.
that process
you may be right.
could
I
take
may be wrong.
2 or 3 generations before it takes place.
I don't care if they love me. Just let me do
Exactly.
business. Let me do business with them. That's all. and many of the people in the West Bank I interviewed when I was over there didn't quite understand, really had a lot of problems with their own leaders, didn't quite understand what was in it for them in this Intifada, and they just want to go to work in Israel. They want to do their jobs.
Exactly. Well, Mr. Levy, it's been a pleasure. I thank you very much. It's been a very quick half hour, and I look forward to having you on the show some other time also.
Anytime, and you'll come on my show too. Okay,
I look forward to it. In the meantime, for our audience, just, of course, whenever you read the newspapers, make sure you try to get as much of a varied perspective as possible. I'm sure you'll read as much as you can on the internet today. There is so much to read, and there's so much to find out about. And it's always good to be an educated consumer, and especially when it comes to Israel. There's so much to find out about and so much history that goes into creating the situation we're facing today. So that's my advice to you. Any final advice, Larry? You have 15 seconds?
No, don't just read Newsday, but make sure you read other papers too.
All right. Sounds good. In the meantime, let's go out and do something. Make your world a better place. Do something. Bring some light into somebody's life. Do something for your community. There's a lot of darkness in the world, but we all have to stand strong and stand together to make sure we do something to bring a little light, because a little light can push away a lot of darkness. Take care. Shalom. And we'll see you next week, same time, same station, for the Jewish Spotlight.
Sisu besim, hu besim, chas hagiyu.